a lot of slides with many pictures to cover up. Before beginning my talk, I want to say thank you to Hoon, because we developed the idea of my presentation together. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you about Seoul's urbanism with case studies. The role as the organizer of the symposium is to show you around Seoul. So please do not blame me, it's not academics. The urbanism in the studies will be interpreted by concept of a spatial law as Hilliard defined. These will be explained through the prism of heterogeneous network, including spatial and social network. In this context, today's presentation is composed of three parts. First, Seoul's spatial changes explained diachronically for the brief introduction of Seoul. And second, I'll present several case studies to explain how the spatial law and transspatial counterparts are responsible for these spatial changes and how these spatial changes are mutually informing and transforming urban spaces. Lastly, in order to clearly interpret this phenomena, I will indicate the shortcomings of an existing spatial network analysis method. Subsequently, I will explain the direction for my future research for heterogeneous network. With the founding of Joseon Dynasty in 1394, Seoul was subject to urban planning. The urban form of Seoul is circumscribed by 4 mountain ranges, which became the boundaries of the city. 2 concepts came into play in Seoul's urban plan. The first concept includes 2 Confucian principles. The first principle, the shrine to the king's ancestor to be placed to the left, and altars to the spirit of the earth to be placed to the right of the palaces. The second principle called for having the government office in front and the market to the rear of the palace. The second concept was based on principles of geomancy, which called for mountains to the rear, water to the front of the palace. The water is the Han River in this case. Particular attention was paid to the blue dragon on the left and the white on the tiger on the right. Mountains to the front and back of the palace, and a far mountain connected to the vital forces of the earth. Specifically, the city planning of Seoul was based on the main axis. Gates, main buildings, and other important places in the city were located along the main axis, running north to south. The axis determined the location of Gyeongbokgung Palace, right here. And the main axis was also considered in city planning. You can see this is the wall of the Seoul and 4 gates here, and this is Gyeongbok Palace and another palace, Changdeokgung, and this is Jongno Street. As described before, Seoul lies in a basin surrounded by 4 mountains. After the rainfall, the rainwater runs together to form a waterway. The waterway flows into Cheonggyecheon, with traverses through the center of Seoul. Along these waterways, roads were formed to join the north and the south of Seoul, and these roads were linked with smaller streets which connected to the neighborhoods. In this way, the stream and streets were linked to form detailed urban structure. The picture shows Seoul's spatial accessibility. The street with the highest accessibility is Jongno, which still retains streets with the highest accessibility now. Besides this area, the main street traversed the city center on an east-west direction. Except some south-north axis, most areas are significantly low accessibility, and they are segregated from the existing spaces. The result of the early 20th century shows, as shown in the 15th century, the east-west axis Jongno has the highest accessibility. Construction of Changdeok-gung, the palace that I mentioned before, this one, and Sejongno, again, this is a symbolic boulevard, created an important north-south axis. In 1930s and 40s, unlike previous periods, the city expanded to the south and a grid street network was formed. The spatial accessibility confirms the formation of a street grid. In the 1930s, what we call modern urban city planning was established for the first time in history. After the Korean War in 1950s, Seoul was burnt down completely, and various urban plans were implemented, especially in 1970s, with the rapid development of the Gangnam area, southern part of the Han River, and Gangbuk's population and facilities began to disperse. From the 1980s onward, Seoul became multi-centered and experienced the rapid urbanization to take its present form. The picture shows spatial configuration from 1960s to 2000s. As you can see in the picture, the highest accessibility of Jongno in all the city center has maintained its 14th century form until 1970s. From the 1980s, you can see the urban center core is moved from the old city center to the new center in Gangnam area, located on the south of the Han River. At the same time, you can see that spatial accessibility of the center of Seoul area is the accessibility is increased in the whole area of Seoul. The picture shows you the changes in Seoul's spatial structure in a compressed fashion. These are same scale. In particular, Seoul's area has not changed much after the 1980s, but Seoul's spatial configuration has shown dramatic changes. As you have seen, unlike other Chinese or Japanese cities, Seoul did not consider the geometry much. It was a city built with nature along the mountains and a skein of streams. There was, of course, a meta order that prescribed the position of palaces and administrative buildings, but it was by no means geometric nor pragmatically sophisticated enough to penetrate into the everyday lives of ordinary people. Within this politics, free space, have citizens, or better, liberal individuals nurture their own spatial culture to the extent that nature allows. However, the city is now buried after a short period of modernization and economic growth underneath the intricate layer of unprecedented values. Strict geometry has been added, although being incomplete in itself, and institutionalized as such to be blended completely into the spatial culture that is already there. To discover it is like a painstaking job of archaeologists. Space syntax has been a great success in this respect, but I should admit, at the same time, there are some difficulties as well. In the last 70 years, ambitious urban plans have been implemented to keep paces with a rapid economic growth. In this process, the institutional power, disguised by urban planning, began to intervene in the spatial world that incorporates in the everyday lives of people. The institutional power sometimes collided with the spatial law that resulted in the way people's way of life harmonized naturally with space. And sometimes the people's way of life became the principal agent in creating a spatial culture. These phenomena have created Seoul's distinctive urban form. Before our discussion proceeds further, let us view Seoul's urbanism from a spatial law perspective. Also, let us look at a case study demonstrating the concept of institutional power, which is a counter-relation to spatial law. Firstly, let me introduce you a place called 피맛길. It means a road which avoids horse-drawn carriages. The road was created by ordinary people themselves to maintain their way of life in response to existing spatial structure. Yeah, you can see the red lines here. These are all 피맛길. Jongno, the main road in Joseon Dynasty, served as a thoroughfare where high public officials paraded on their sedan chair or horses. At the same time, ordinary people were obliged to bow to the ground in courtesy, dropping everything that they were doing. In order to avoid these inconvenient encounters, the people created a new narrow road only 1 to 2 meters wide, which ran parallel to the main road, Jongno, and in front of the Changdeok Palace. Yeah. The road represents the ordinary people's desire to maintain the way of life and is still in use today. The next representative urban space has been transformed by spatial power. Rapid economic growth has resulted in corresponding changes in urban spaces. As seen before, urban spaces which incorporate the ordinary people's way of life were demolished overnight. In their place was taken by spaces of a completely foreign order. Traces of the old ways of life which were recorded in the neighborhood spaces were removed in its entirety. As a result, apartments occupies about 50% of residential form in Korea now. Under the guise of urban planning, institutional power imposed changes in the ordinary people's way of life. Gated communities have increased thereafter. With increasing isolated urban spaces, communities have weakened. Social problems are on the increase. For the detailed interpretation of Seoul's urbanism in the two perspectives, the first case study is about urban blocks created through the mutual influence between the spatial law and its counterparts, trans-spatial road. Let us look at the formation method of Gangnam, the process, and Gangbuk. With the Han River as the center, the spatial network of the old city center Gangbuk and the new city center Gangnam are similar. However, the formation process is very different. In other words, the present spatial structure is similar, but their production process are at opposite. The street network of Gangbuk was formed over a long time in harmony with the waterways and the people's ways of life. In the 1930s and 70s, a supergrid was imposed almost instantly on the top of very intricate urban structure. In contrast, the street network of Gangnam was created by the government's plan for the new city center, based on a powerful supergrid. And in this process, the street network, which resembled the urban structure of Gangbuk's older city center, have filled space within the blocks. In other words, the people's way of life that have not changed over time, and it filled the interior of a powerful supergrid of Gangnam. As this case studies illustrates, Gangbuk formed over hundreds of years, and Gangnam, built in the last 40 years, have blocks with a different spatial law, but the interior blocks are almost similar. However, the people's way of life have created a similar spatial network, as you can see. which have resulted in harmonizing the spatial law with the counterparts, the transspatial law. The second case study is the Jokbangchon area, where people who have nowhere to go to reside. Jokbangchon is the most inferior of the housing for the poor. It means an area where rooms are subdivided into smaller units for lease. You can see the scale of a room with this picture. This area lies in relatively busy commercial districts in the old city center. It is here where the most economically disadvantaged class find their housing in a dense cluster. This is the short history of the area. Until 1936, it was a disorganized market of a 5-year-old. After the Korean War, it became a red light district for a 20-year period. In the 1970s, it transformed to Jokbangchon as now. Even though there were no change in the spatial structure, the change of users have resulted in the change of a spatial function dramatically. As the map shows, this place is located in a busy area close to the 2 subway stations, Purple Line and Orange Line. However, it is not directly connected to the road, and it requires penetrating 2 depths to reach it, as you can see in the map. You can see the depths. In contrast, the interior shows a distinctive and grid spatial network. Like this. The result of the space syntax analysis shows that the rows near the block show high integration. In contrast, the interior rows show dramatically lower integration, segregated. In other words, it has a urban structure which is isolated from the busy urban area surrounding it. As the spatial structure analysis shows, Jokbangchon is isolated from its surrounding areas. However, its interior shows highly intelligible spatial configuration with a good connectivity with the accessibility. The spatial configuration can influence not only how we perceive spatial boundaries, but also how we determine psychological sense of solidarity. Under this premise, I have analyzed the social network of resident field surveys. The result shows that even though the residents feel exclusion and psychological isolation from the outside, they also feel closely connected to each other. The results confirm that they view Jokbangchon area as their own living space. Furthermore, the sense of closeness between neighbors is shown to be higher than in their previous place of residence. Their level of social association, such as a reliance among neighbors, is also quite high, as you can see from the analysis of a social network. In Seoul, with the passing of time, changes in spatial or transspatial law have occurred in almost all areas. However, the Jokbangchon area has experienced functional changes despite having undergone no change in the spatial configuration, even though the use of space has changed dramatically. The occupants have used the spatial characteristics in a very intelligent way. They know that this area allows them to be socially isolated from the outside, but enables them to be closely interrelated in the inside. We have conducted a study on the mutual correlation between spatial network and social network in this area. The results of the space syntax of the location of each resident house and the correlation with their social network show that the R-squared value of 0.74 between the two factors is quite relatively high. This study shows not only what the role of space syntax analysis of our social network and spatial network can play, but also indicates a possibility of a new network which combines these two existing networks. We have a very challenging task ahead of us. Thirdly, let's look at the changes in spatial configuration of traditional housing caused by the rapid construction of apartment complexes. Residential areas which were formed by alleys were demolished, and apartments began to encroach on the city center. The urban fabric and the sense of a place, which was sustained over a long time, disappeared now, and a new residential spatial structure appeared. I interpret this phenomenon as institutional power supported by politics and institutions overriding spatial law. Let us examine how the proliferation of our apartment complex has influenced the consciousness structure regarding Korean residential complexes. First, we will look at the difference in spatial hierarchy in relation to spatial configuration of the main spaces of apartment complexes and facilities. The traditional villages is generally located according to nature and geometry. The village spaces and facilities are placed in relation to the central road. In contrast, the apartment complex is basically a gated community with walls enclosing the facilities located inside. As the picture shows, the forms of traditional village and apartment complex have very different spatial forms. However, through the space syntax analysis, we have determined a very interesting fact. The facilities of the traditional village and the apartment complex have a similarity in their spatial hierarchy. For example, as the picture shows, the spatial hierarchy of the spaces of a congregation of the traditional village, such as a big village tree, wash place, or a marketplace, and the apartment complex such as a plaza, a market, or a shop, both occupancy highly integrated places. Both occupy highly integrated places. Furthermore, the order of the spatial hierarchy in relation to social, commercial, welfare, educational facilities are almost identical. In addition, if we analyze the spatial hierarchy of social spaces, there were almost no instances where the plaza was central to the social facility in the early apartment complex in the 70s. Even if the plaza existed, it was placed in the isolated location. After the 2000 years, plazas and social facilities became more numerous, and they were located in similarly highly integrated location as in the traditional village. The next case study is Cheonggyecheon. This stream is located in the middle of the old city center, and its length reaches about 10 kilometers. Before the Korean War, it was part of everyday life of people as a wash place and playgrounds. After the Korean War, however, Cheonggyecheon became a ghetto where refugees and the poor congregated to live. It was subject to not only flooding problem, but post-sanitation problem as well. In all, complex social problems developed. In order to solve this problem by city, the government and the city covered over the stream. 7 years later again, with a great volume of traffic, an elevated highway was constructed over the covered Cheonggyecheon. This elevated highway served for about 30 years as an important traffic link connecting the city center to the east of our city periphery. In 2006, construction to restore the waterways of the stream was completed. Despite protests from experts who placed a priority on traffic and urban functionality, civic groups and merchants from the nearby areas, the institutional power, backed by political will and expert advice, have restored the Cheonggyecheon to the present state, as you can see now. It has experienced enormous change over the 50 years through intervention by numerous agents. After the restoration, the urban use of adjacent area is being restructured, and the socio-economic network is also experiencing changes as well. There is much debate over whether the restoration project is valid from the historical perspective. However, as in the past, the people are enjoying this space. With the change of paradigm in regards to viewing the city, the space represents a case study where the will of numerous agents were in play. As a result, it has recovered its original form. The last case study is Jangsa-dong area in the old city center of Seoul. The residents of this area, because of the need to survive, and to overcome limits of a spatial network, have removed the boundaries between the public and private space. The orange signs in the map shows the corridors connected in this way. It belongs to the private space. This place came into existence where street vendors began to sell military equipment and tools flowing out of the US Army base during the Korean War. Vendors who conducted their business over the covered Cheonggyecheon area in the early 1960s began to move into the blocks, such as traditional Korean houses or hanoks were located. Through this process, this area has continued to be urban manufacturing area, supporting the manufacturing industry nearby the city center. Shops selling tools were located on the main road, while the smaller side streets were occupied by manufacturing shops. These shops sell household goods, jewelry, cameras, medical equipment, measuring instruments, electronic goods, machinery tools, etc. These are supported by restaurants, public baths, which conduct business in the alleys. In the middle of the block, buildings have a manufacturing shop on the first floor and housing on the second floor. Their congregation has created a dense and busy ecology. The streets of this area are isolated, but the spatial network cross over public and private spheres to the intertwined like small blood veins. Of particular interest is that to link the corridor of one building to another, or to link an alley with a private courtyard of a house, the residents have given their space to public to serve as a corridor for the neighbors by locating their belongings on the streets, as you can see in the pictures. They have formed close connection with which have developed into a social ecological network in this area. However, the area is faced with a crisis. With the restoration of Cheonggyecheon and the redevelopment of the recent adjacent areas, this case study area of factories and shops is designated for resettlement. The city of Seoul has built a new multi-purpose complex in the southern area and planning for them to move there. Among the companies that followed by Seoul's guideline, some have gone bankrupt and some have returned to the original locations. The resettlement plan of this area, which was designed, designated as being undesirable to be located in the city center, has completely failed. It currently represents a headache for the city government. I think that the reason for the failure of the resettlement plan lies in the failure to understand the area's existing spatial network and interior social network, as well as the ecological system between the industries. It will be difficult to recreate the social spatial system of the area, which has been built up over decades, by simplistically offering a new physical space to move in. To sum up the episodes that I've shown you, spaces sometimes become political and industrial individual subjects or citizens are awakened to act politically. They sometimes succumb, but more often demonstrate how they are spontaneous or extemporaneous and creative strategies can ridicule or even outstrip the rigidity of the power. The dynamics are essentially heterogeneous and could never be reduced into a single layer that is purely spatial. For in this whole process of attention, the spatial law itself seems also to be distorted or at least deferred from operation for a while. In this context, instead of confining the oppositions of the two laws within the two separate domains, what I suggest here, in a way, to overcome the difficulties is to enfold them with all of their actors into a single vast network. Such a network will be heterogeneous in nature, in which a spatial organization not only takes effects on transspatial contrasts, but also gets shaped and transformed by and through them, for which the lexicon of the spatial law should be translated into and thus connected with that of the transspatial law on a commensurable basis, however provisionally it is. This idea basically requires a post-structuralist epistemology, or perhaps actor network theory in which no dichotomies between nature and culture, matter and concept, individual and group, technology and institution, and even space and society can maintain their places. We do not know yet exactly how space syntax, which is itself an actor, can be adapted to the network. Space syntax may take a central position while defining other actors and weaving the network around it. But in order for this to occur, it seems that space syntax may need to open it further to its outside and consequently be mobilized from within. By returning back to Seoul, the city is currently like an amorphous field where various actors and actants interact under the influence of omnidirectional forces. The restoration of natural resources and the traditional values, an increasing demand for citizen participation, and an uncertain shift towards an extremely mobile lifestyle, the law enforcement for urban planning, the regulation of real estate speculation and unequal developments, that the social structure reorganization to cope with the global market's challenges, and so on. The network, these forces will be expected to evolve over time. Several possibilities exist. First, forces may converge to a certain stable state, but also we predict that after a necessary time lag, it may diverge to an unexpected, perhaps unimaginable level as well. To draw such a network, our first step to investigate new urbanism of Seoul in a more distinctive form is applying various processes of translation and representation. It is also necessary for us to act wisely within the network and ultimately share power democratically with others. Thank you.